William Wallace is no longer the outlaw he once was. He's now a fearsome guerrilla leader at the head of a large body of men. But will it be enough to throw the English out of Scotland for good? Find out in this week's History vs. Hollywood.
Hello, and welcome back to History vs. Hollywood, a podcast where every week we dive into some of the real history behind some of your favourite films. At the moment, we're covering William Wallace and Braveheart, and this is the third in a 4-part series on the subject. In this particular episode, we'll be covering his rise from a rebel leader to the taking on of Scotland's armies and how he used them to smash the English at Stirling Bridge and eventually become the protector of Scotland. So if that sounds interesting, please do go ahead and listen, and let's get into the show.
Before we get started with the show, just want to give a quick shout out once again to Nicholas Kircher. Nicholas is a new friend of mine, and he's been absolutely invaluable in editing these episodes as they come out. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Nicholas is also a writer on Substack. He writes this absolutely fantastic publication called A Chemical Mind, where he covers stories of our fascination with the brain, from medical mysteries, great triumphs and cautionary tales, to great discoveries and tragic failures, conspiracy theories, technology, and more. It's just brilliant. Definitely give him a check out. I'll put a link to his show in the show notes. And now, on with the show. Thank you.
Last time we left William Wallace and his merry band, they had just defeated the Knight Fenwick at Loudon Hill and finally avenged William's father. They were now a well-armed and horsed band of some 60 men teeming with confidence. Following their unlikely victory, they retired to the forests of Clyde and spent some 20 days getting drunk and having a raucous good time. Old Willie Wallace and his companions started off fairly well, but that doesn't mean it was all going to be plain sailing from their first success at Loudon Hill to the crushing victory at Stirling Bridge. No. In fact, it would be very touch and go for Wallace for some time yet, and a long time before he took centre stage as Scotland's superstar. When the English heard about the ambush at Loudon Hill, to everyone's surprise, they decided it best to call a truce with Wallace and his band. Perhaps they were sick and tired of chasing him around the countryside, or perhaps they just had better things to do. Who knows? Wallace's long-suffering uncle brought the terms of the truce to his hidey hole in the woods and eventually put him under enough pressure that he begrudgingly obliged. For the time being, the fight between William Wallace and the English was off. The truce was to last 10 months, and with no English killing on the cards to keep them entertained, Wallace's band split up and most returned to their homes. Wallace, too, returned home with his uncle and got about the business of doing nothing. Wallace being Wallace, though, the idleness chafed at him. Sitting around at his uncle's house all day just simply wasn't as fun as the usual swashbuckling antics he got up to. So one day, when his uncle had popped out, he snuck out into town with 15 of his cronies, all dressed in disguise. I imagine they were all dressed very unconvincingly as enormous hairy milkmaids, but who knows? On this particular day, a passage of arms was passing through the town, where a famed English champion was offering to fight anyone who dared face him. Wallace watched him knock a few challengers into the dirt, got the measure of him, offered himself as the next opponent, and in typical Wallacean style, swiftly slew the champion. It dawned rather quickly on the watching English soldiers that the enormous blood-soaked Scotsman standing before them must be none other than William Wallace. A brawl then broke out, with lots of swords and hacking and stabbing and all that sort of thing. Before long, Wallace and his chums had violently killed 29 English soldiers. Classic Wallace. The story goes that with the terrible mess Wallace had made, the only consequence was that someone sent a letter to his uncle asking him to keep his troublesome nephew away from the town centre so things like this didn't occur again. William, shown the letter by his uncle, once again begrudgingly agreed to behave himself. He would manage to go a whopping 16 days without killing anyone. In September, in 1296, William's uncle received an invitation to a council in Glasgow. Wallace came along as part of the entourage, perhaps because his uncle didn't fancy leaving him unattended again. On their way to Glasgow, William rode ahead of the main party with 2 companions, where they eventually bumped into some English soldiers at the tail end of the baggage train heading to the aforementioned council. In a fashion that I'm sure by now you're beginning to find rather tedious if you've listened to the rest of this series, as you'll no doubt be able to guess the outcome, the soldiers treated young Master William rather poorly. They commandeered one of his fresh horses and gave him in return an old nag that was well past its prime. William, amazingly, managed to control himself to the point where he didn't immediately lay into them with his sword. He's growing up, it seems. In a rage, though, he rode back with the old nag in tow to the main party of his uncle. He relayed what had happened to his uncle, who, being the sensible one out of the two, tried to calm him down as Wallace was now red in the face with anger, telling him it was better to lose a horse than a nephew, or something along those lines. Wallace, however, let his temper get the better of him, turned his horse, and charged back off after the English. When he eventually caught back up with the English, there was no doubt that he was there to bring violence. The English turned and charged him and his two companions. Wallace coolly dismounted, drew his enormous blade, and then with a vicious swing, took the head off the first horseman. He did the same to the second, and wounded a third, leaving him to die. Wallace then made quick work, pilfering all their gear, stealing their pack horses as well as their destriers, and a large amount of gold and silver. It does make you wonder if all of Wallace's violent incidents stemmed from righteous anger, as he does almost invariably seem to get away with large amounts of loot, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, after this brief but violent interlude, Wallace thought it best to carry on towards the council and stay ahead of the news. Wallace and his chums legged it to Glasgow, rode right through the middle of town and back out again before the English could say, "Why, that Scotsman has an awfully nice horse," and made good their escape into the wilds. Word of William's exploits arrived quickly in Glasgow. This time, there was to be no rap on the knuckles and an extension of the truce. The council declared him an outlaw once more, making him fair game for anyone to kill without consequence. William's temper had once again gotten him into hot water, but I'm sure he thought the temperature suited him just fine. He still had many friends in Scotland, outlaw or not, so Wallace had no real trouble finding sanctuary. He was not one to lie low, however, but quickly got about raising a band of some 60 men. They were cutthroats and murderers, the lot, but like Wallace, they were all desperados, willing to do whatever it took to bring violence to the English. I mentioned earlier that it wouldn't all be plain sailing for William. It is around this time where the wind picks up a bit and the waters start to get choppy. That being said, things did start out fairly well for Willie and his new comrades. Their first target, a tower in a place called Gargunnock, fell without much fanfare. They managed to sneak in the middle of the night, as the Muppets who manned the tower had left the drawbridge down. Finding the door barred, Wallace put on a show of freakish strength, ripped the door off its hinges. They were in. Wallace and co. then got about their bloody business and murdered everyone inside. They did, however, and would pretty much always spare the women and children. A good start. One English stronghold down. Hundreds to go. On to the next one. Wallace and his gang next decided to attack a chap called Sir James Butler, seemingly only for the reason that he'd crossed William's path. That, and there was a good chance of some serious loot at Butler's castle, Kinclaven. Wallace and co. made their way to Kinclaven and parked up in a woody hollow nearby to stake out the joint. Before long, outriders rode past Wallace's ambush spot ahead of Butler's main party, who had conveniently left the castle on some sort of nightly business. When the main force was in sight, it all went very much like the ambush at Loudon Hill that we'd covered in the last episode. Wallace springs his trap, they charge in, make lots of scary Scottish war cries, stab at the horses with spears, Wallace cleaves off the head of a leader, Bob's your uncle, the Scots win the battle. Wallace, then being the indomitable man of action he was, charged off and broke into the castle. Once again, the drawbridge had been left down. When will these Englishmen learn? The usual murdering of all besides the women, children and priests followed. Wallace then made a rather chivalrous mistake of letting Lady Butler, wife of the now late Sir James, go. She rather too quickly made her way to Perth, a nearby town, and raised the alarm. Before Wallace had barely had a chance to burn the castle down, 1,000 armoured horsemen were heading his way. This is where things would start to go very wrong for old Bill Wallace. Swiftly retreating into the woods in which they'd lain low earlier, Wallace tried to make himself scarce. It wasn't long, however, before 1,000 or so horsemen had the place good and surrounded. Wallace had bitten off more than he could chew, and was quickly fighting for his survival. He fought a desperate rearguard action as he tried to draw his men further back into the woods. During the battle, he even took a glancing blow from an arrow to the neck. His men were putting up a good show, but the English numbers were telling. Somehow, in the confusion of the battle in the woods, Wallace managed to slip away, leaving some 10 or 15 of his men dead from the day's work. It was a very lucky escape. Things would continue going wrong in this fashion. After licking his wounds, Wallace almost met his end when he was betrayed by a woman he was having an affair with. The affair was discovered by the English, and under duress, the woman gave away the details of her next meeting with Willie. Wallace, who wore a dress far more often than Braveheart lets on, got wind of the English trap and managed to sneak out of town in a dress once again, before being captured. He made it to the gates, where the 6'7" woman was questioned by the guards. Wallace knew the jig was up, so he did what he did best and lay about himself with his sword, leaving the guards dead. He then legged it back to his hiding place, but unfortunately for William this time, the English had a bloodhound. Before long, William and his men were surrounded once again. Another desperate fight in the woods ensued, and again William was forced to flee, leaving behind many dead comrades. One of which, William even supposedly slew himself. Apparently the guy had a wobble and said he couldn't keep up all this running and would hand himself in to the English. Wallace lost his temper and cut the guy down in front of the rest of his gang. Perhaps he was feeling the pressure, or a new, harder man was beginning to replace the wild youth that Wallace had once been. Either way, it is tough to justify in the killing of his old comrade out of hand. Wallace ran all night and barely escaped from this encounter with his life. He was eventually found by a few local boys, half dead in a bramble bush. Recognizing that they had stumbled upon the famous William Wallace, they brought him to an uncle who lived nearby. What a day for a couple of 12-year-olds, eh? Can you imagine going back and telling your mates you'd found actual William Wallace sleeping in a bush? I mean, you could dine out on that for years. Wallace was now at the bottom of a pit of despair. His forces scattered, and 2 stinging defeats in a row by his hated enemy, the English. On top of that, he was guilt-racked and torn by the killing of his old friend, whether or not he felt he'd been betrayed by him. This was to be his lowest ebb. Once he was recovered, Wallace met with 2 of his companions and made good his escape from the area. His first campaign had been reckless and had ended in disaster. They headed south and took stock and shelter near the town of Lanark. Now, William seemed to take to the town of Lanark. He's described as heading into town frequently for sport by Blind Harry, his somewhat unreliable biographer. That could mean one of 2 things in my opinion. Firstly, he began to stalk the alleys of Lanark, putting back on the character of a wandering serial killer, filling the alleys with murdered English soldiers who were unfortunate enough to be alone when he came across them. That's one option. The other could be that it was in this very town where young William was to meet his wife, Marion Braveheart. Marion was a likely lass of 18, daughter of a local noble, and Wallace was smitten with her. She returned his affections, and they were soon married. William, the wild womanizer, had finally been tamed. He was no man to let domestic bliss get in the way of his desire to kill the English, though. And it wasn't long before he'd raised a new force of some 60 men and was causing trouble in the local region. Wallace and his gang spent a happy winter fighting skirmishes with English cavalry, storming castles, and then running back into town to spend the evenings with his new wife. All was well in the world of William Wallace. It wasn't to last, unfortunately. By the spring of 1297, William had spent so much time in Lanark that he'd gotten a little too comfortable. The local English soldiery was now well aware who was in their midst, but as he was usually surrounded by 10 to 20 of his favourite toughs, they thought, best leave him alone. Wallace eventually let his guard down, and one day, when he was leaving church, unarmoured for once, a group of English soldiers surrounded him and his companions. They threw insults at him, claimed they'd all had his wife, and demanded that he hand over his dagger. This, as it so often would be, was a mistake the English would soon live to regret, but not for very long. Wallace lashed out with his customary whirlwind of violence, and before long, he and his companions left 50 dead English soldiers on the streets of Lanark. They were still terribly outnumbered, though, with the garrison numbering some 200 men. Wallace and his companions fled back to Marion's house. They barred the door and tried their best to make their escape out the back. The local sheriff, a famously unpleasant chap called Heselrig, with hundreds of men, surrounded the front. Marion did her best to slow them down whilst Wallace and his men escaped, but it was too little, too late. Heselrig smashed down the door of Marion's home and immediately killed her out of hand for standing in his way. Wallace, seeing his wife's callous murder, was maddened with rage and had to be dragged away by his men lest he be captured. He would not wait long to exact his revenge. That very same night, Wallace, with some reinforcements who had joined him out of outrage at the killing of his wife, snuck back into town one man at a time. Presumably, the English didn't expect the bandits they had fought earlier to return so quickly. Once inside, they reformed, made for the sheriff's residence, where Wallace burst into Heselrig's home and cleaved his skull from his shoulders whilst he was still in bed. With that done, Wallace unleashed his force against the garrison of Lanark. In a rampage that lasted all night, Wallace's band slew some 240 men. The garrison of Lanark was utterly annihilated. With this act, though it may have been motivated by a desire for personal revenge, something much bigger than William Wallace would start. News of his success spread through the land, the Scots now knowing for sure that the English could be beaten, and rebellion swept through the realm. The First Scottish War of Independence had begun. And on that note, perhaps it's time we should take a little break. Please join us again after the break as we continue this tale of William Wallace and the journey from here to Stirling Bridge. See you soon.
You might think that we're heading to an ad break now, but that's actually not the case. The intention with History vs. Hollywood is to keep it ad-free and completely supporter-driven. If you'd like to support the show, the best way you can do so is subscribe, if you're already a subscriber, by upgrading your subscription, or if you're not quite ready for that sort of commitment, you can go ahead and buy us a coffee. All of the details of how to do so can be found in our newsletter. If you're reading this on Substack, well, it's just below. Or if you're listening to somewhere else, perhaps on Spotify, Apple, or on YouTube podcasts, well, you can find the link to our newsletter in the show notes. Thank you so much for all of your support so far. All of the money goes towards paying our artists, contributors, and allowing us to focus on this show and give it the attention it deserves. Thank you so much again, and now back to the show.
Hi and welcome back. Things began to move quickly now for William Wallace. Wallace seized the opportunity given to him by his actions at Lanark and raised the flag of rebellion. By midsummer, Wallace rode at the head of 3,000 armed men, and the whole of southwest Scotland was ablaze. Taking inspiration from Wallace, other isolated rebellions flared up across the country, most notably one in the far north led by a young chap called Sir Andrew de Moray. Moray was from a powerful Celtic family, and in the spring of 1297 he raised his banner at a place called Ormonde and began to drive the English out of his lands. He led an army of common men the English described as a very large body of rogues, and those rogues would make life very difficult for the English occupiers in the region. Meanwhile, Wallace led a daring raid on Scone, the site of the recently removed Stone of Destiny, the stone upon which Scottish kings are crowned, and captured it with large quantities of booty, a blow designed to strike at the heart of the English regime in Scotland. By late June of that year, all of southern Scotland was up in arms. English troops had all retreated south of the border, been killed, or holed up in their castles. Scotland's subjugation had been broken. With all of this going on in Scotland, you might be wondering where our old friend Longshanks was. Edward was preparing for a campaign in Flanders against the French, still smarting from having his lands taken away by the French king. It's hard to say exactly how aware he was of the goings-on in Scotland, as myth and rumour abound during this period. One such rumour being an enormous battle that supposedly took place between 60,000 English, led by Longshanks himself, and William Wallace. Supposedly they met, and William Wallace utterly destroyed them. This almost certainly never occurred. Another rumoured event, that probably never happened, relates to the opening scene of Braveheart. Around this time, it was said that Edward Longshanks invited 300 or so Scottish nobles to a barn. The barn was extremely well defended, and he only let them in one at a time. As they stepped in, a noose was thrown over their neck, and they were drawn up into the rafters to die. In this manner, Edward Longshanks supposedly got rid of around 300 Scottish nobles. The list of dead unfortunates includes that of William's own uncle, his long-suffering uncle that raised him. This, again, probably never happened, but is presumably the inspiration for that scene at the beginning of Braveheart where a very young William Wallace finds a barn full of dead men and freaks out. Wallace himself apparently only managed to escape as he was forewarned and then fought a dashing Wallacean-style escape with the usual swinging of a sword and beheading of knights and so on. It's a good story, but it does seem to come down the ages from hearsay, rumour, and, pretty natural willingness to paint the English as behaving very, very badly. For one, the uncle that raised William Wallace was certainly alive after the date of the event was supposed to happen. Plus, there is almost no record of 300 gentlemen, barons, and knights, etc., disappearing from the region in one go. It's all just a little too good to be true, I'm afraid. What almost certainly is true was that by midsummer 1297, Scotland was in a state of total anarchy. The English oppression of the preceding years had given the Scots for the first time a real sense of nationhood. They were drawn together for the first time by a common enemy, the English. Longshanks, busy with France or not, could tolerate no further delay in sorting out this whole mess. He ordered a chap called Percy to gather an army, head north, and deal with the interminable Scots. With 40,000 men at his back, Percy marched north and met the Scottish army encamped at a place called Irvine. After all the successes of the previous month's rebellion, the Scots, disappointingly, were once again at each other's throats, making them disorganised and vulnerable. With Wallace and Moray still in the field causing trouble, the Scottish nobility once again kowtowed to the English and surrendered. Without a sword being swung, the whole Scottish army ignobly surrendered within days of the arrival of the English. The surrender left William Wallace filled with disappointment. Once again, he had been let down by the nobility of his realm. He and Moray were having none of it, however, and continued the fight. The unfortunate truth, though, was that Wallace was now the only Scottish general still in the field south of the Forth. Wallace was very vulnerable. But he didn't let the disappointing display at Irvine keep him down for long, and he quickly set off on an expedition to Argyll, western Scotland. Here he met and defeated a small English army at the pass of Brander. Then throughout the rest of the summer, Wallace headed to the Highlands and made trouble for the English garrisons in the area. Meantime, the aforementioned Percy, commander of the English forces, had decided that although he technically achieved his objective of defeating the Scottish army, it was best that they also deal with the ever-present threat of Wallace. They decided to head towards his supposed hideout, an encampment in the great forest of Selkirk, not far from a little place called Stirling. The clouds of battle began to gather over Stirling, as events drew Wallace and the Scots towards the English at this fateful place. It was around this time that Moray and Wallace's respective rebellions met for the first time. The two supposedly immediately took a liking to each other. They joined forces and knocked off a series of stunning victories. Perth quickly fell to the Scots, with 2,000 English soldiers killed. Following this, Wallace raced to Aberdeen, where he managed to catch the fleet stationed there off guard and destroyed it at harbour. By now, all of Scotland north of the Forth was under Scottish control, all besides the fortresses of Dundee and Stirling that lay at siege. The English decided it was now or never. 2 English armies converged and headed north to relieve the siege of Stirling. When Wallace heard the news, he left the siege of Dundee that he was supervising, sent word to Moray to join him, and headed with all haste to Stirling. It was time for a showdown. Stirling Castle was arguably the most formidable in the British Isles at the time. It sat upon a high crag, giving a commanding view over the surrounding plain, making it almost impregnable. Through the plain meandered the River Forth. For centuries, Stirling and the bridge that crossed the River Forth had been the key to defending the lowlands of Scotland from the wild men of the Highlands. The solitary bridge was wooden and only wide enough to allow 2 horsemen to cross abreast. This would cause a problem in the very near future. The English army needed to capture said bridge, form a bridgehead through which it could pour through, and once that was achieved, it would head up into the Highlands and make quick work of any rebellion that remained there. If it couldn't get through and form a bridgehead, well, then it was in pretty serious trouble. The stakes were equally high for Wallace and Moray's army. Lined up on the hills, watching the vastly superior English army approach, the Scots' knees must have been knocking under their kilts. If enough of the English army made it over the bridge, there was nothing they could do to stop it. That was the big dilemma on Wallace's mind on the day of Stirling Bridge. How many English should he allow to cross? If he let through too many, then he wouldn't be able to defeat all of them. But if he let through too few, then we'd still have the majority of the English army on the other side of the bridge to deal with. Wallace had to get this right. In the English camp, there was also much worry. The English commander, the Earl of Surrey, was well aware of the risks facing him. He needed to cross a small bridge, and once over it, assault the Scots, who were in almost perfectly unassailable position. He called a war council, which quickly devolved into bickering about what to do. Some hotheads in the crowd wanted to throw caution to the wind and charge right in. Cooler heads wanted to find a better crossing point. The Earl of Surrey was stuck in the middle, trying to make himself heard. It wasn't until Edward Longshanks's trusted treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, a grossly fat clergyman, now looking all the more ridiculous he'd managed to stuff himself into a suit of armour, stood up and shouted them all down. "This is all costing far too much as it is. Let's get on with it, shall we?" he shouted, or something along those lines. The Earl of Surrey, perhaps sick and tired of the whole thing, and stung with the embarrassment at the implication that he was wasting the crown's money, acquiesced and gave the order to cross the bridge. This was a mistake. From his vantage point, Wallace watched as his plan came together perfectly. The English started moving across the bridge with painful slowness. Wallace watched and calculated, and by 11 o'clock, the time was right. Wallace put a horn to his lips and blew the signal. As the sound echoed along the Scottish lines, it was met with a roar of battle cries. Like an enormous spear-bristling wave, the Scots washed down the valley and crashed into the unexpectant English lines. The right and left flanks of the Scots enveloped the English, cutting through their lines to meet at the bridge and cut off any source of retreat. Once this was complete, the main Scottish forces clattered into the English and got about their bloody work. A stampede occurred on the bridge itself, and many English were crushed underfoot or fell from the bridge to be dragged to the bottom in their armour. From the southern side, their comrades could only watch in horror as the English forces disappeared inside a ring of blood-soaked Scots. The few English that did manage to break free cut their way through the bridge, crossed it, and ordered it to be burned to keep the defeat from turning into a cataclysmic disaster. They did so and left their comrades to their fate. The slaughter was total. Some 5,000 footmen, 300 archers, and 100 mounted knights died at Stirling Bridge. The Scots fought all day till the last Englishman was dead or driven into the river to drown. Seeing that the day was lost, the Earl of Surrey, who fortunately for him stayed on the south side of the bridge, gave the order to retreat and turned with the remainder of his army and fled without stopping, all the way back to Berwick. When the day was done, the Scots' losses were inconsequential. The only real blow to the rebellion on that historic of days was the mortal wounding of Andrew de Moray. He would succumb to his wound not long after the battle, leaving Wallace as the sole leader of the rebellion. On the English side, things were a bit worse. For example, the grossly fat Cressingham, the clergyman I mentioned earlier, the one who'd shamed the Earl of Surrey into crossing the bridge and sealing the army's fate because it was all getting too expensive, fell in the battle. Rumour has it that Wallace killed him himself with a spear, but that seems more likely to be poetic license than fact. What is known, though, was his posthumous fate. The Scots, upon finding the body of their hated enemy, flayed him of his, rather substantial amounts of skin, chopped it up, and handed it out as grisly souvenirs from the battle. The day was won. The Scots had defeated the English. Stirling Bridge would go down in history. An enormous English army had been driven out of Scotland by William Wallace. He truly was the saviour of Scotland, and in the aftermath of the battle was appointed the protector of the realm. This was all very nice for William, I'm sure, but there was still lots of work to do. And that is where we'll pick back up next time. And that's all we have time for today, so thank you very much for joining us. Next, we will look into the end of the story of William Wallace. The Battle of Stirling Bridge would prove to be the high point of William Wallace's career. He'd have a few more good years yet, but it wouldn't be long before it all went wrong at the Battle of Falkirk. That's what we'll cover in the next episode, and then his downfall from the Battle of Falkirk to his pretty grisly and gruesome death at the hands of the English a few years later. So, if you're interested in hearing about that, please join us next time for another episode of History vs. Hollywood. Goodbye.
Thank you again for listening to an episode of History vs. Hollywood. I really hope you've enjoyed the show. You might have noticed, but I'm just beginning to get this show off the ground, and it would be invaluable to have your support in doing so. The best way you can help us out is by leaving a review wherever you're listening. You can do this on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, wherever. If you happen to be listening directly in Substack, perhaps you could just let me know what you thought in the comments. If you like the show, please go ahead and like it. You can restack it, or if you really like the show, then perhaps you would consider adding me to your recommendations. That would be absolutely amazing. On top of that, there is a paid option, so you could consider upgrading your subscription. That would go a very long way to supporting me, helping me pay my artists and contributors, and buy research materials that make this all possible. But that's completely optional. I'm just happy to have you here and listening. So thank you once again, and we'll see you next time for another episode of History vs. Hollywood. Goodbye.